Aujourd'hui, je vais parler de how ramen broth is strangely kind of like wine, at least to a simple dude like me, after all. Who doesn't like wine, right? Or ramen, all kinds of ramen, right? Hey, XenPuck here. So first I gotta admit that it was a surprise to me when I first saw an entire restaurant devoted for ramen. And this was in the New York City of, I'd say, the late aughts, maybe 2007 or 8 or 9 or so. Previous to that, all Japanese restaurants that are easily visible in New York City were mostly about sushi, maybe with a few izakaya places thrown in there. Alas, one day a friend of mine took me to her preferred ramen shop in the East Village. Shout out to Betsy, by the way. And thus started reckoning that perhaps even the humble noodle soup can now be considered fine dining? Okay, maybe not fine dining, but definitely not just a way to clean up leftovers at home, right? And over time, I have to say, the concentration on ramen over all other noodle soup has started to escalate and confuse me, right? So today I want to talk about my feelings on just one aspect of the general grouping of noodle soups, the broth. Okay, and why? Just like how most people can't really tell expensive wine from cheap wine in a blind test, these two food and drink groups are quite similar in that way. Okay, so first of all, there's just too much variety. Okay, I don't think I need to talk about the wine part, right? Everybody already knows the choices that you have in wine as vast, right? There's grapes, regions, types of soil, all sorts of taste notes that you could fit on a page of adjectives, right? So is that also the case for ramen or noodle soups? Actually, these days I'd say yes, right? Just within regular Japanese style ramen, you can have your soy salt based, your miso based, your tonkatsu based, and that's without layering on spiciness levels, right? On top of that. Let me be clear, when I talk about ramen, what I'm really talking about is the entire East Asian noodle soup category, right? Which will also include further types like pho or just plain old beef noodle soups, or even Japanese udons, or the type of ramen that has the broth on the side that you're supposed to pour yourself a measure when you're about to eat it, yada yada yada. Right? Note that your toppings will also change the flavor of the broth. So even though at the start of my rant it sounded like there's only, I don't know, a handful of bases, 5 or 6 bases, once you start calculating the permutations possible, that's 5 bases plus, let's say, another handful of spice levels, plus 10 possible different taste-altering aromatics, plus 10 different vegetable combinations equals... This is a multiplicative process, right? You get my point, right? At least hundreds, if not thousands, of mildly different permutations come to mind. So the issue is, with this many choice, has anyone who's not a professional eater actually tasted and is able to recall them all? And if not, then how does anyone know for sure whether their current favorites will remain their favorites for all time? Point number 2, here's the reality, right? I simply also basically like all the noodle ramen broths that I've ever had, right? Almost without fail. Same with, similarly, all the wine tastings that I've been to, okay? Now, for wine, I might remember the first 2 wines that I try at a wine tasting and have a distinct preference between, the first one and the second one. But after that, I really don't recall. I just like all the wines, right? Exceptions of, there is some exceptions to that, and that's very sweet dessert wines. But still, the vast majority of wines, I enjoy, probably because they give me a buzz, okay? Is that reason enough, right? But I can't tell you whether one type of red is more preferable to another, just even within the color scheme, right? Much less what I would prefer with specifically, a different type of meat, right? After all, even if I was able to say, let's say I prefer a full-bodied red with beef, right? That still sounds weird to me, right? Because we don't really just make beef the same exact way all over the world, right? Because there's at least dozens of ways to enjoy beef. So how could I possibly know that I'd like the same red for even one single type of animal? Now, back in ramen land, same idea, right? Maybe I haven't liked, I think one type of spicy Thai tom yum soup type of flavor for my ramen broth, right? But that's the exception. 99% of the time, my goodness, there's nothing as comforting to me as a big bowl of noodle soup, right? Sure, it needs to have some spices and maybe a little sweetness, a little bit of oil and fat in it, but which particular type and what specifically makes me love a broth? I have no idea because I like almost all of them, right? What I care much more in a ramen are the fillings, right? Because I can tell you whether the chashu has been done correctly, right? If it's pork that's in there, or whether the preferred style of soft-boiled eggs are just the perfect shade of soft-boiled, right? Or whether all the corns sunk to the bottom, or whether why some places skimp on fish cakes. So to me, toppings are the king. The broth, I mean, because the broth is almost always good in my book, I basically just ignore it as a thing that determines whether I'll get one bowl versus the next, right? And point number 3. By the way, I also want to mention that strangely, just like wine, ramen broth is kind of a value trap, right? I'll bet you've seen a study where, regular folks without knowing the price would prefer regular wine just as often as they prefer really expensive wine, on average, right? And yet, if made aware of the price, most people would prefer the more expensive wine. That seems pretty logical to me. After all, we all want to feel like we're getting our money's worth, right? And that's very similar when it comes to ramen broth, right? You can buy a bowl of ramen whose broth has been simmering for days, thus making it highly unlikely to be replicated at home, right? Unless you live in a professional kitchen. My point is, I can get why some broth are more expensive because they're extremely time-consuming, right? It uses real bones of fancy pigs or whatever. But I'm just a pleb, right? Do I think a broth that's been simmering for 48 hours or a week is going to be mind-blowingly better than one that's only been simmering for, let's say, 6 hours? Not at all, okay? Unless, of course, I was told that the broth simmer time in advance, because then I would feel like what I'm eating isn't just regular, but something that takes a monumental level of effort that I could never personally do, and therefore is worth it, or worth more. And somehow I've already convinced my brain that the extra effort would not have gone to waste, right? But on a day-to-day basis, I use packets that I get out of any ramen that I can buy in any supermarket or Asian market or the internet these days, right? Honestly, you can get 20 different styles of instant noodles off of Amazon these days. Just mix up the packet a little bit and every broth will taste pretty darn good and not cost hours or days of our lives, either in preparation time or in money equivalent. So in conclusion, do I think there are people who can appreciate the fanciest of ramen broth, just like how there are people who can remember every wine they've ever had? Yes, I'm positive that those people exist, but they must be in the very, very minority, right? Maybe I just don't have that complicated or sophisticated of a palate, and frankly, I think that's a great thing, because that means I'll always be a cheap date, and I'll always have a good time with the simplest, most available of ingredients. At the end of the day, isn't that what any of us really wants, right? Not to literally have the fanciest of tastes and meals, but to enjoy even the easiest and simplest meals that we can make. And with ramen broth, it is so easy to make something slightly different every single time. I can eat it, that whole noodle broth group for the rest of my life. God bless noodle soups. Cheers, a la Proshin.